Welcome to week 4 of Seek Growth. Today we are looking at a quality of God that in Hebrew is called Netzach, and that means eternity. Well, before we go on, let's welcome our guest, Rabbi Aaron Finkelstein, from the far west nether regions. Is that what it is? Is that west?
Up Mulholland?
Yeah. I think it's west. It's west northwest. Yeah. The far.
Sure.
Rabbi Finkelstein is from the middle school. We're very happy to have the good rabbi, who's a great partner in all sorts of things, including this. And we'll hear more from him soon. So let's go back to where we were starting. Netzach, perseverance, eternity. As a quality of God, Netzach, or eternity, as we've been discussing, is the idea that God persists forever. And the complicated issue with this particular quality of God is that we can't do that. So there isn't an exact parallel like appreciation of beauty or fairness where we have a human parallel to this aspect of God. But nevertheless, there is one. And in the sense that God is eternal and persists and perseveres through everything, we have our human parallel in perseverance. And we're going to do some stories on perseverance, and specifically different types of perseverance in the Jewish tradition, and then, of course, we have to bring it back to sports at some point. So let's begin, and Rabbi Finkelstein will kick us off with one of the most famous Jewish stories of perseverance.
Terrific. Thank you, Rabbi David. Nice to be here with you guys. So I always think, when it comes to perseverance, of the story of Rabbi Akiva. It appears in the Midrash, in Avot de Rabbi Natan, and in the Jerusalem Talmud. But the Rabbi Akiva was the greatest sage of the Mishnah and probably of the entire generation of sages.
Would you say he's the LeBron James of Talmudic sages?
Maybe even better. Maybe
Jordan.
Maybe even the Kobe Bryant of Talmudic sages.
Maybe the Kobe Bryant.
So third.
Maybe the Michael Jordan. Maybe the Steph Curry. Hard to say. Had to throw it in there. So the later sages ask, what were Rabbi Akiva's beginnings? And they tell this incredible story that Rabbi Akiva was basically an ignoramus and, did menial work for the first 40 years of his life. And one day, after a hard day at work, he's sitting, taking a break, and he sees that water has hewn out, has been dripping over this boulder, and has actually eroded a hole in the stone. And he takes a look at this and he says, is my mind harder than stone? If water can slowly, over the course of many years, drip, drip, drip through and create a hole through stone, maybe the Torah, maybe wisdom can have the same impact on me. And the sages relate that he goes and he studies, and he ends up starting with, the very basics, learning all.
He was illiterate.
He's sitting. The next scene, he's sitting in the kindergarten classroom with his son, and he's learning Aleph Bet, one letter at a time, with his 5-year-old son. And eventually, years go by, 13 years go by, and he finally has a clinching argument against the great sages. And then they say, go, there's the army that's been waiting for you that you've ignored, now you have to go and fight it. And for me, I always think, here's somebody, he wasn't trying to become this great sage, he just was interested in the learning. And just over time, let it literally wash over him.
Okay, so to summarize, Rabbi Akiva goes from being illiterate at the age of 40 to how many years later?
13.
13 years later, he's basically the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, one of the greatest legal minds of his time. Not that the current Supreme Court justices are necessarily great. We don't get into politics here, but that's basically what it is. He takes the road from the lowest to the highest,
the rags to riches of the Talmud, if you will.
Intellectually speaking.
Yes.
Intellectually speaking. Okay. And great. Anything else about this story that we should add before we sort of break down and talk about it?
I would just say the one other thing is, during this time in the Omer, we remember Rabbi Akiva's subsequent students. It said that he had 26,000 students who tragically died during this time period. But you think about go from completely illiterate to 13 years later becoming the greatest sage, and then however many years later having 26,000 students that were following him. It's incredible.
And as a side note, the death of his students is one of the reasons why some Jews are more bearded than usual during this time, because not shaving your beard is a sign of mourning in the Jewish tradition.
Really?
So
Yeah.
you might notice that our beardless friend over here, Dr. Holton, semi-bearded friend over here,
He's not going to shave
is much more clean-cut looking than the rabbis in the room. But we're not going to focus on that. Okay, so Dr. Holton.
Yeah.
Okay, give us a little bit about like perseverance and the related values and like that as a character strength, and we'll sort of relate it back to the story.
Right. So there's lots of things kind of going off in my head, but as I listened to the story the first time we talked about it, and then here when Rabbi Aaron repeated it, the first thought in my head was, what was the water's purpose? Like, did it intend to, make its way through the rock, or was it just sort of there for its own sake, and that ended up being the result, right?
For its own sake?
For its own sake.
Hebrew?
I don't know that.
Yes, you do.
I do?
Yeah. Lishma.
Lishma.
Oh, well, I think of that as learning for its own sake.
You're
Is that the literal translation?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. So when I heard, especially when you followed up and said, well, he was illiterate, the next question that popped in my head was, well, did he have a goal, which was to become literate, right? And the reason I'm asking those questions is a lot of the terms that we'll talk about today from the psych perspective are, they connect to perseverance in that we tend to persevere a lot of times, sometimes when it's attached to a goal, but a lot of times when it's not. Like when we enjoy the process for its own sake, as was the case in the story. It was not a results orientation, right? So we'll go into a bunch of different stuff, but we'll talk about things like grit, which is a goal orientation. It's passion and perseverance for long-term goals. Angela Duckworth's research at UPenn. We'll talk about resilience, which is bouncing back from bad stuff as a part of perseverance along the way. Dr. Karen Rivich's research also at UPenn. But we'll also talk about things like growth mindset from Carol Dweck at Stanford, enjoying the process, which eventually leads to positive outcomes, and then intrinsic motivation from Richard Ryan and Edward Deasy at the University of Rochester, which essentially is experiences that are inherently satisfying. We don't do them for an external reward or result. We enjoy the experience itself. And that connects to all sorts of things like autonomy and purpose and a sense of growth and competence.
Wow.
A lot of things I would imagine are present in that story. He freely chose to pursue it. He attached it to a greater purpose. He got to develop mastery along the way.
So let's jump into some of these things. I think one of the questions, sort of my first question with the story is like, why did he do it? Like, what was the dissatisfaction he was feeling with his life that made him want to make that change? And then that's related to like the goal. Like when he entered into the Beit Midrash, the house of study, was it because he wanted to have like 25,000 like Twitter followers or whatever, like his students who are following him? Or was he just like learning for its own sake and seeing where it would take him? Like, was it, another way of looking at it is like his son was starting school, and even though he thought he'd never be able to be a learned person, like he thought, all right, like I might as well learn something also.
Yeah. I should add too, I mean, when I mentioned for its own sake, in some level that's a little disingenuous, because I think even though there might not be an outright like conscious goal, there's very little that we do purely for its own sake. I would argue that a lot of these experiences and perseverance, growth mindset, intrinsic motivation, they all sort of tap into an inherent human need, which is a need for satisfaction via personal growth, personal development that a lot of human beings share. And you can make an argument that that in and of itself is a goal, even if we're not acknowledging it as the goal. Right.
So when Rabbi Akiva goes to study, is he like upset if he doesn't become the number one ranked Talmudic sage of all time because that's his goal? Or is he just happy to be living a life? Is he satisfied with the fact that he is on a constant growth trajectory intellectually.
It seems like I imagine this might have been the kind of thing that he always wanted to do, and he finally...
The studying or the goal?
The studying. I don't think he had any illusion of the goal. If he's illiterate, he probably doesn't even know who the great sages are at the time. He might not even have been in that world, but like Dr. Holden said, okay, my kid's going to school. I've always wanted to go back to school. Maybe I'll sit in on a few classes. And then once he's there...
He doesn't even know that he's becoming number one.
He has no idea. He's just shooting free throws, man.
Eventually, he's Kobe Bryant.
Steph Curry.
All right.
Or John Wooden.
We'll get there. We'll get to John Wooden also, who I think is ranked number one for college basketball coaches.
Certainly.
We're going to get to John Wooden. So, Holden, you want to start us off with some of the language and the diving into what perseverance is?
All right, so let's...
Wait, sorry. Before you do that, can I just add one other
please.
Rabbi Akiva tidbit, which is, and this is something that our 8th graders study, which is that other people, specifically his wife, basically paid for him to be able to study for 24 years. So it took other people's sacrifice, in addition to his own, to recognize that, hey, he has great potential, but also he's not currently satisfied. Let me do what I can to help him, to achieve or to just because he's enjoying it. So I think that's an important piece also, that there are other people who will help us to persevere.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's a major component of resilience as well. But that's actually a decent segue. So let's start with something like intrinsic motivation. I mentioned 3 components, one of which was purpose. And purpose is essentially when we get to connect the me with the we, what our individual skills and traits bring to the table, but how we also get to use those in service of something greater than our individual selves. So when we talk about something like perseverance, which is basically, the willingness and the desire to overcome obstacles, to finish what one started, to persist, for me, it's less about what exactly that definition of perseverance is, and more about what creates it and what it leads to. And we know empirically that what it leads to is success for the most part. And whatever that goal or that orientation is, perseverance is highly predictive that we're going to get there because we overcome the obstacles. Take something like a goal theory that we use a lot at the school, which is WOOP goals, WOOP. We can post a podcast to explain it a little bit. But the second O is identifying obstacles that are going to get in your way. And the P is planning for how you're going to overcome those obstacles. WOOP is essentially a goal theory for perseverance, right? But, if you think about some of the other elements, the growth mindset piece, the resilience piece, the grittiness piece, what those are made up of, to me at least, are a focus on the process itself.
As opposed to a focus on the goal.
That's right. It's actually somewhat paradoxical in that when we tend to focus on the goal, this is a part of that WOOP process and research, it's essentially positive illusions. We reward ourselves for these really positive beliefs, and that actually sort of demotivates us. It drains us of a little bit of the energy. We reward ourselves simply for thinking about doing that goal or accomplishing that goal, doing something good, and then we kind of chill. Whereas when we create the tension and that obstacle and plan to overcome that obstacle, we sort of acknowledge like, okay, this is going to be difficult, and that's also in part what makes it worthwhile, right? Eternity, to a certain extent. I'm going to have to fight through this.
Right. And in I don't know if it's related or unrelated, but in current, parenting language, one of the things that you're supposed to do with your kids is actually, instead of praising the results,
right,
you praise the effort itself.
Right.
The working toward is itself what we should be focused on. And what we're going to get to in a certain sense is how that fits into our culture. We have a culture where effort itself is perhaps not celebrated enough, or the satisfaction that we feel when we put in our best effort is ignored because we're really focused on whether we achieve the goals or not.
Right.
All right. Sorry to interrupt.
No, I mean, that was more or less it. And I totally agree. American culture in general is a very, very results-oriented culture. And that makes some sense on some level. Results do matter. I think what we're acknowledging is that there are, again, it's sort of paradoxical. to sometimes get the best results, you don't focus on the results. You focus on the process. This is essentially what habits are too. Like habits are the process that lead to outcomes. And if you just take care of your habits, the outcomes become increasingly likely. Right? So, for instance, we talked about Wooden. We're going to get back to him, but that's a good example where you mentioned earlier his tension with Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and the way he went about things. And I would argue that you said exactly, Jabbar was upset with how John Wooden, former UCLA basketball coach, would react to both wins and losses.
Okay, so I'll just tell this story. So Kareem Abdul-Jabbar was the Rabbi Akiva of basketball players in like the late 70s, 80s, right? He went to play at UCLA and then not immediately, but eventually played for the Lakers. And Kareem Abdul-Jabbar was coached by someone who became his best friend, who was John Wooden. And John Wooden had a lot of quirky qualities. And something that really pissed Kareem Abdul-Jabbar off in the early days when he was at UCLA was that Wooden's reaction to winning and losing wouldn't be any different. And Wooden was the most winning coach in college basketball history. I think that's true to this day. And so the players who came from a culture where all you care about is winning, that's how they became like, UCLA hasn't been very good at basketball for a while, but in that day they were amazing. These were players who really cared about winning. And so how could their coach not react differently to a big win from a devastating loss? And it came from Wooden's own definition of success, which is closely related to what we're talking about. And the definition is, from John Wooden, success is peace of mind, which is a direct result of self-satisfaction in knowing you did your best to become the best you are capable of becoming. I'll say it one more time. Peace of mind, success is peace of mind, which is a direct result of self-satisfaction in knowing you did your best to become the best you are capable of becoming. So putting this definition of success, which incorporates like implicitly like perseverance, because you are putting everything into becoming your best. Whatever the obstacles are, you're doing your best. Like that's all there is to it.
And back to what I spoke to earlier, that's a core need. If you look at Maslow's pyramid, if you look at Clayton Alderfer's pyramid, if you look at intrinsic motivation, eudaimonia, neuropsychological research on like core needs, they all involve an element of satisfaction from growing and developing. Nowhere in there is there anything about winning.
Right.
Just growing. You can't always control the results.
Right. You can't. I tell my students, you can't control necessarily what other people do. What you can control is the effort you put in. And your own growth potentially.
There's a couple episodes ago we talked about the NBA playoffs, and I think that's a great example where I'd make an argument that all the teams left are putting forth tremendous effort, and they put a ton of growth into this, and it's coming down in a lot of these games to a play or two.
Yeah.
Right? Like, does that mean that all the growth they went through, all the effort they put in is somehow invalidated because they didn't win that game? It's not always totally under their control, especially in team sports.
And also, if you ask, if we're talking about the playoffs, some of the best who are striving toward a particular outcome, but there's a whole league and thousands of other players who did everything they could to get there and just didn't quite make it. And you ask them, was it meaningful? Was it worthwhile? Hopefully most of them are going to say, yeah, it was incredible.
Right.
I was the last person cut before an NBA roster, and, I was, an incredible journey.
What this made me think of what might be interpreted as a challenge to Wooden, which comes from Yoda.
Do or do not?
Do or do not. There is no try.
Rabbi Yoda throwing it down again.
maybe Yoda's challenging is in a certain sense challenging that idea. Like Wooden is just saying try your best. Like that's all that really matters. That's what's going to lead to satisfaction. You persevere and try your best, and the perseverance is specifically in the effort, as opposed to like persevering toward the goal. And Yoda is basically saying like, no, like what matters is whether you've done it or whether you haven't done it, not like the amount of effort that goes in. I don't know. I would think that Wooden and Yoda would get along pretty well in general.
And Rabbi Akiva, as long as we're...
And Rabbi Akiva and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. All right. Should we talk
Yeah, so just like last week, we said, we're taking on kind of a new model. Rather than suggesting these activities or interventions to the audience, we're going to actually do them in front of them. So we'll take just a quick break here, get that set up, and then we'll execute sort of like how to think about and build some of these characteristics of perseverance. Okay, so we're back. We're going to start kind of doing the intervention. Our focus for this week then is to really kind of concentrate on those moments of perseverance. So where ideally in these moments, our ability is just below the level of challenge that we're facing and what we're trying to persevere in. Okay? So the rabbi was incrementally moving towards literacy, right? So we mentioned a couple of terms before the break. I want to kind of frame these a little bit. But the first thing I want to talk about, which is a fairly famous video at this point, again, remind me of the rabbi's name. Or no, he's a psychiatrist. And a rabbi?
And a rabbi,
okay.
Yeah. Abraham Tversky.
Okay, so Rabbi Tversky has this video, right? He explains how lobsters grow. Essentially, it's basically that when a lobster feels itself growing, the fleshy part of the lobster moves against the rigid shell. The rigid shell of the lobster cannot expand, so the lobster feels uncomfortable. Right? It goes under the rock, sheds the shell, grows a bit, develops a new shell, and repeats that process over and over again. So the whole idea is the impetus for the lobster to grow is that it feels uncomfortable. So how does that translate to psychological research and this idea of perseverance and inherently satisfying growth-oriented activities? Let's start with something like the concept of flow, which comes from Dr. Csikszentmihalyi, who just retired from Claremont, one of the early positive psychologists, brilliant researcher, brilliant mind, and the father of flow theory. And flow, one of the dominant characteristics of flow, which is a deeply immersive, inherently rewarding experience. Students watching this, think video games. You don't play video games necessarily to win or lose. You play because you enjoy playing the game.
Unless you have an issue where you don't enjoy it unless you win.
Maybe. That's the goal orientation, right?
And sports, when we play most of the time, let's say.
We like to win.
We like to win, but
it doesn't mean we didn't enjoy playing the game sometimes, right?
Okay.
At least in that moment.
Yeah.
Okay. So one of the dominant characteristics of getting into those flow experiences is that those experiences should be about 4% more difficult than our abilities allow for, right? It should be a little difficult. It should be just a little hard because that challenge for somebody with a growth mindset is really intriguing. So you look at growth mindset research. Why is that intriguing? Well, somebody with a growth mindset would sit there and look at this challenge and say, yeah, bring that challenge on. I know I can grow from it. That's what a growth mindset is. We believe intelligence and skills can be developed. Somebody with a fixed mindset is just going to quit when they face a challenge because they think their intelligence and skills are fixed. They're not malleable. So why would I bother to take on a challenge if it just increases the likelihood that I'll fail? Somebody with a growth mindset is saying, whether I fail or not, I'm going to be the lobster. I'm going to grow from this experience. And
I'm going to be able to persevere in the effort, regardless of whether I actually achieve the goal or not.
Right. Absolutely. And that, we don't want to get too tangential, but that attaches to hope, which we talked about earlier this year, but wrote a little bit about, which basically, do we have the confidence that we can initiate and sustain the motivation to create this change or this growth? And do we have strategies to do it, right? The lobster not only understands that it can do it, but it has the strategy, right? So go back to something like intrinsic motivation. We see challenge there too. I mentioned one of the core components in addition to purpose, which is oriented towards other people, is mastery, which is oriented towards personal growth. And so Daniel Pink in Drive has this great metaphor for a mastery. It's an asymptote. It's asymptotic. It's something that we can constantly chase, but never actually achieve. We get incrementally better bit by bit. Mm-hmm. James Clear in Atomic Habits would call those 1% incremental improvements, right? Again, just like with mastery, how do we get 1% better? Well, we get a little uncomfortable, we challenge ourselves in a little bit, and we grow day by day. And that, in and of itself, hits that core need of satisfaction and growth. Like every little increment that we move, that we grow, is inherently satisfying. And I imagine is something that the rabbi experienced in the original story.
Yeah. It reminds me a little bit of one of my teachers in rabbinical school. We would have these talks about how to change yourself, and he would, at the end of it, he would always say, don't try to change yourself. Just try to change like 10%.
Yeah.
Because that, you don't have to change, you can't change yourself overnight, but if you do something a little different over time, it accumulates and accrues.
Absolutely. I recently read the book. I just mentioned it, Atomic Habits, but there's a great sort of analogy in there where that has to do with goodness of fit, like what we can and can't be. So genetics is going to predispose us to some things, but not necessarily predetermine, right? If I only grow to be 5'8", it's going to be hard for me to make the NBA, right? But
you're at least 5'9".
Well, I'm about 5'11", but that's besides the point.
And he can dunk.
And I cannot dunk. Can you dunk? You're the basketball player.
David can't dunk.
I stay pretty close to the ground. I'm not one of those air basketball players. I'm like the ground basketball
Gotcha.
player.
Okay. Fair enough. So anyway, he basically says, water hardens an egg and softens a potato. We don't get to choose if we are the egg or the potato. We have to find the right fit that, kind of allows us to experience the proper growth for our true selves. Yeah, we're going to talk examples, I think, right? Like I'm just framing, but you guys have, real life examples where you've experienced these sort of things?
Well, one example I'm thinking about, and this relates back to Rabbi Akiva, but as a rabbi, is people think that you're studying all the time. But in fact, I don't know if you have this experience, Rabbi David, but I find it very hard to
Nobody
find
thinks
any...
he's studying.
I'm not. Yeah, I'm never studying.
But do you wish you were? So, don't answer. Anyway, I very much miss all of the ongoing learning, and one of the things I've really tried to incorporate into my days is just a little bit of reading or study for its own sake, or a little bit of writing for its own sake, and it's been fascinating to me. I have not been successful. It's on my calendar every week for an hour, and I'm not always successful, but the times where I have been, and by that I mean putting in the effort and just the time and shutting my door, it's amazing what I end up getting out of it, just in terms of my own energy and inspiration. And yes, it's led to, one idea ended up developing for a talk that I gave over Passover. I mean, there have been tangible, or I guess more specific outcomes, but... The
orientation, though. You don't necessarily go into the experience for those outcomes.
Yeah, and in fact, I've found in general with writing, and it's much harder to produce a compelling idea. This kind of gets back to what you were saying, when you are outcome-oriented. When I go in and I just say, I'm just going to read this, piece from Parker Palmer, or study this piece from, Shai Agnon, or a piece of Talmud, then you're open to it and you can just enjoy it, let it wash over you and see what happens. So I'm trying more and more to just make that a regular practice, to persevere, if you will.
Great. How about you?
I don't have a particular example right now that I'm thinking about, but I do think that when we talk to our students who, every once in a while are not happy with the outcome of their, like a test or a paper or a project or something like that, I think that one of the most difficult but also most important things is to help them find the satisfaction in the effort that they put into it, and shift the focus away from did I get the grade I want to did I put my best effort into the work. And to me, that's like the cultural issue that I think this value of perseverance, this like spiritual value of eternity is really about, is can we help those we're working with and ourselves like focus on the effort and reward the effort and praise the effort, instead of like being a completely results oriented society.
And I think that's where, going back to sort of your original definition or, conceptualization of eternity, right? Goals are not eternal. Goals are outcomes, fixed outcomes. You reach them and they're
Right.
done, and then you identify another one. And that's inherently part of the problem. We've had conversations about hedonic adaptation. You reach that goal, it is satisfying. We're not necessarily trying to speak against goals. The problem is you quickly adapt to achieving that goal, and then you move the goalposts and say, okay, what's next? On to the next thing. And when we do that, in terms of its impact on happiness, we're constantly chasing our own tail, right? We're never really setting ourselves up to be in the moment and enjoy the moment, because it's always about the next thing.
So I think what we want for like this week of Netzach, eternity, perseverance, what we really want is we want to take time to focus on the effort and celebrate the effort. And for me, I'm thinking like, what is it that I do in this week that I take a step back and I say like, wow, like I really put my best effort into that. Like I don't know what the results are going to be. I don't know if the outcome is what I wanted, but like that should be celebrated. And I think there's a beauty to that, like in all sorts of aspects of life.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
We can think also about relationships, that there's no particular goal in mind, or I don't usually have a particular goal with how I'm relating to one of my parents or a friend or something like that, but it's a great way to persevere and invest.
It also ties back to that earlier point, like the relationship piece. We don't always control how other people respond to us or think about us or react to us, right? We kind of do the best we can to be empathetic and thoughtful and sensitive in whatever ways we need to, and then some of the rest of it's out of our hands.
Yeah.
All right. Special thanks to Rabbi Finkelstein
Thank you for having me.
for being here. Thanks
to
to
be
Dr.
here.
Holton. This is the week of Netzach, of eternity, and we're focusing on not the ability to be eternal, but the ability to persevere and prolong and stay with effort and sustained focus on something. And hopefully this week will help us rethink these issues.
Persevere.
Persevere. Thank you.
Thank you.